Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming to Norwich's United Nations Anti-Racism Day, sponsored today by Norwich and District Trades Union Council and Stand Up to Racism, the Norwich and East Anglian branches. Of course, although it's a UN Anti-Racism Day today, every day should be Anti-Racism Day, and that should remain the case until we don't have any racism. My job today is a very simple one. It's just to welcome you on behalf of the organisation, and really just I'm going to say a few words of welcome to our speakers, Clive Lewis, Alison Mallock, and the rest before I hand over to Julian to be our host and chair for the afternoon. I just wanted to say that one of the slogans for today is "Black and White Unite and Fight," and that really brings me back to when I first came into this movement. Back in 1977, assembling outside Keir Hardie Hall, getting a coach to London for a big demonstration, anti-Nazi League campaign, and that was our chant on that day. So it's good to give that something of a revival. As I said, this is jointly sponsored by Norwich and District Trades Council and Stand Up to Racism. I also would like to say a few words on behalf of my own union, National Education Union, who are also supporters. And since we don't have an input later on in the day, I just wanted to draw attention to two campaigns that we're involved in. One big national one around decolonising the curriculum called Celebrating Education, and also a smaller scale local one, which is around rolling out an unconscious bias training programme and developing an anti-racist teaching framework. And that's going to be hopefully a big part of this year's Black History Month across Norfolk. So without further ado, I think I will, oh, sorry, let me just say there are, this is one of 4 activities today. The other ones, one has already taken place, which was Taking the Knee. Another one took place last night, which was lighting of City Hall. And then directly after this, there is going to be a music festival, accessible by using the same link that we've got. So I think now I will hand over to Jude to take care of proceedings. Okay. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Ian, for that introduction. Can I also say that this will be recorded, so if you're not happy with recording, could you go on off screen, or just to let you know that will be one of the things we're doing this afternoon. So I have had the great pleasure and privilege of working with an amazing team to bring this together, and we've got some incredible speakers. Can I invite you to use the chat room? If there's anything that comes up from the speakers and you'd like to know more, put it in the chat room and we'll put you in contact with them to get some more details, because obviously it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the things they're going to be talking about this afternoon. But my first question to you, just to set the scene for the afternoon, is does anyone remember who said, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist? Anyone remember that? Can you put in the chat room if you like? Can you? Oh, Julie. Yeah, who was that? You're on. You have to unmute yourself. Can you do that? Great. Oh, still not happening.
It was, I think it was Maya Angelou.
No, before I know you don't get the prize. Anyone else want to go for the prize? Because this is what we're all about. It's about activity. Martin, who is it? Who said that? And you're on mute too, Martin. Oh, Martin, I'm going to have to lip read if you don't come off.
Okay, yeah. Was it Ben Lindsay, the CEO of Power the Fight?
Nope.
Oh, right. Okay.
No, okay. I'm going to invite you all to put it in the chat room. And if by the end of the time no one gets it, I will tell you who it is. Okay. So to kick us off this afternoon, we have the pleasure of a video recorded by our very own MP, and that's obviously Clive Lewis. He's also the president of East Anglia Stand Up to Racism, so double-hatted, and we're very thrilled that he's managed to do a video for us. So over to you, Wendy, to start our video.
Hi there, Clive Lewis, MP here. I can't speak at today's event, but I wanted to give a message of support. I'm speaking at the Media Democracy Festival today, which I think is pretty important to take part in. But I wanted to give a few words of support to you as you gather today to stand up to racism. Look, I think this has been a massive year for struggle against racism and the anti-racist movement, not least because of the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and all that came from that. And what that did was, I think that taught many of us who already were aware of racism and structural racism, it showed us how deep racism runs through our society and how prevalent it is and how we are going to have to up our game if we're going to take it on. And I think ultimately, when you look at what's happened through COVID, where that has shone a light on the inequalities and often the racial inequalities within our society, within our economy, not just here, but across Europe and in the United States, you can see now how imperative it is that we begin to tackle that and change that. There's a reason why Black people are disproportionately dying. It's not because they're Black or there's something in their genetic code that makes them more susceptible to COVID. It's because they're more likely to be poor and disadvantaged, more likely to be working in low-paid jobs where they can't socially isolate, they can't afford to socially isolate on statutory sick pay. And this is an intersectional struggle because we understand that whilst Black people are overrepresented in those figures of people dying, we know that if you're disadvantaged generally, to make a difference what color you are, you're going to be more affected by COVID. And that's, I think, critical because it tells us that we're not going to be able to stop racism simply by having more tests or bias testing and different bits and pieces. Actually, what we've got to do is tackle the very root causes of that racism. And clearly, that's a capitalist system which has inequality at its core. And if you want to tackle that, you've got to bring in policies which lift people up, tackle inequality, and give power to people and power to communities. This is about an overhaul of our democracy, which is in crisis, but it's also about making sure that we, the people, have more power over our everyday lives and can take on and challenge those vested interests who it's in their interest that we remain divided and that racism continues to exist. So this is a class issue as well, and I think we cannot forget that. So the fight against racism must be seen in the context of the class struggle which takes place and is taking place across the world and in this country. We can't forget that. I think to look ahead, we can see that there is going to be a real struggle. We have one of the most right-wing authoritarian governments this country has ever seen. It's also racist as well. And we know that they're targeting, using the law, i.e. the police, courts and sentencing bill to target protests, to target Black Lives Matter, to target Gypsy, Roma and travelers, to target women and groups who are standing up for oppressed minorities. It's targeting those people, making it easier to shut them down and to stop our right to protest, our right to gather and disrupt, which is our democratic right to do that. You don't get change in a democracy unless sometimes you can disrupt. Do you think the Chartists or the suffragettes, if they weren't prepared to disrupt democracy, weren't prepared to disrupt society and the economy, were ever going to see change? Clearly, of course not. So that's a fundamental democratic right that is under attack. So there's a lot of work for us to do together, but the fight against racism has to be seen in the light of all the other things that are taking place in terms of class and other intersectional struggles which are happening across our society. But I'm confident for the future because I think people are waking up and I think people are understanding it. It's a very divided time, but it's also a time of an awakening where people are beginning to understand the importance of these issues. If we're to have a civilized society as we move into the 21st century, which comes with real challenges in terms of the climate and ecological crisis and all of that would entail, the growing wealth inequality, surveillance capitalism, the rise of authoritarianism. We need to stand together if we're to tackle those things as well as racism. So thank you for turning up today.
Thank you. It was great to hear that. I mean, I've heard it already. I'm not sure how you've received it, but I certainly heard him throw down the challenge that we need to come together to protest around not being able to protest, because that's how we get change to come about, where we can with one voice say, this is not right, there is a better way of doing it. And certainly, you know, we're coming together today for the United Nations Day for the elimination of racial discrimination. So it's going across the world, and we're showing that we're up for it. We're showing that we're going to be there. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker after Clive, and that's Alison Mallock, and she is the owner and chair of the Equality and Diversity UK company. Thank you very much, Alison. Over to you.
Oh, hi. Yes, I'm Alison Mallock, and I'm the Managing Director of Equality and Diversity UK, which is based in Bury in Greater Manchester. And we work nationally and internationally on equality, consultancy, and really producing resources. And since the George Floyd murder, we have been inundated with organisations coming to us, asking us for support. And the majority of those people have been employers. And I'm really pleased that employers are beginning to take this seriously. And over the last 6 or 8 months, we have been putting together some advice and guidance for employers about all of the things that they do. And we've come up with a 10 C's framework. We've always worked with a 5 C's framework, but as time has gone on, we've increased those C's from the 5 to the 10. So we start off with context, and we look at the context of where businesses are placed, who is in the business, how are they governed by the equality laws. And I think that quite sometimes people don't recognise that the law means that they've got to have the business case as well as the moral case and the legal case. Quite often they're just working on what we do as opposed to what the law requires us to do. So we sort of look at the context. The second C is about how we communicate. And how do we communicate with our staff? How do we communicate the messages from our organisations? People are saying to me, you know, we can't reach racially diverse groups. And actually, it's not that they can't be reached, it's that we're not creatively thinking about how we can reach them. So we're not using the Voice, Press, the Asian Eye. We're not reaching out to them through the local communications that they have. But the other thing is that the language we use and the tone of that language is also not acceptable. So, you know, we hear people talk all the time, and it triggers me, and I know it triggers a whole range of people, on that word BAME. Yeah, and BAME is not a word, it's an acronym. And it's really, really important that we stop using that lazy acronym. The other thing is, it was given to people. It's not owned, it was given. I've got to tell you that going back to the employers, that I'm a chair of local governors at my local primary school. And a few months ago, again, with the George Floyd thing, the National Governance Association said they needed more people who were racially diverse to be on governing boards in schools. So they put on a major event, and I was at this event. There were 85 people who were like me at that event, eager to get engaged and involved, and easy to reach because they were all there, yeah? And the person who was presenting stood up and said, I want to welcome all of you BAME people. And from that moment on, the chat went mad. Julie, I can see the stress. That's how it triggered me as well. But the chat went absolutely crazy. And people said, I am not a BAME person. I put in the chat, I am Caribbean Chinese. I don't want to be referred to as BAME. Everybody put it in. And she said, I've read what's in the chat, but unfortunately, we have got nothing else to work with today. So I will continue to use it. And every single camera went off and everybody left. Yeah, I stayed behind and had a conversation about what had taken place. But that communication is really, really important. You have to think about what you say and how it triggers people, how people receive it. The third C is really about the culture. And we say, what is the culture like in your organisation? And if it's a place that I don't feel at all that I belong, it makes it very difficult for me to be productive. It makes it very difficult for me to feel as though I'm engaging. So we have to think, what is the culture of our organisation? I was on LBC radio recently talking about the Meghan Markle debacle. And one of the things I was saying is that when I got into management, my first management job at a college in Lancashire, I got the job as the manager. I worked hard to get that job. I got my degrees, I got my studying, I did everything. And my manager took me around to every department and introduced me as her first black manager. There's more to me than the colour of my skin, but that's how I was introduced. And although they've opened their doors and they've let me in, part of that culture is still to be oppressive. So it's really important that you think about the culture. The fourth C is about challenge, and really thinking about what are the challenges that employers have and what do we need to challenge. And I think that the challenge has to root out racism from the workplace. To stop minimizing people's experiences, to stop saying that people are playing a card. You know, quite often you can't be impartial if you've already decided that somebody is playing a card. And the fifth C is really about that competence. How competent are the staff within organisations? I'm working with a large organisation at the moment, doing some training. I've just had 3 staff forums, and one of the first questions that I asked the staff was, what is racism? Yeah, because quite often people will say, I'm not being racist, I don't think it's racism. But if you don't know what racism is, how can you decide whether it is or whether it isn't? And if you're not experiencing it and it's not your lived experiences, how can you say that? Yeah, and that's the important thing. You know, when I was on the Sky News the other day talking about Meghan Markle, one of the things I said is, do not minimize people's experiences. You know, somebody comes to you and they say to you, this is happening to me. You can't say, yeah, but, and you can't say, well, you know, I know Ian, he's a really nice guy and he wouldn't do that, because you're actually continuing to trigger me. And my angst and all the things that I've come to you with, I'm never going to speak out again. So it's really important to think about how competent are staff to understand what racism is, what it looks like, what it feels like, yeah, and how to deal with it. That's important. And then the other C, next C, is the 6th C, we talk about collaboration. And quite often we do things without involving those groups. And I remember when I was head of education in Manchester, when I first got there, one of the issues that they had on the line was that they put a new prayer room in. And having put this new prayer room in, they were all complaining that nobody was using it. It was a waste of money. But they didn't collaborate or consult with the people that were going to use the prayer room of how it should be facing, what facilities it should have. So there was no washing facilities. There was a whole range of things that was wrong with it. But that was the lack of that consultation and collaboration. Don't do things to people. Nothing about us without us. You know, Ian was saying before about the black and white unite to fight. Well, ours is nothing about us without us. It's really, really important to think if we are doing things, we've got to collaborate. And the other one is that commitment. And that commitment has to be written down, and it's got to be very, very clear and transparent. What is it you're going to do? I've had so many people who have put things on social media, that the black square on the Tuesday, they've made statements that they're going to be anti-racist, but actually, what does that mean? Yeah, I'm a chair of a local arts organisation in the Northwest, and one of the things that we've done is sat down as a group of people and said, if we're going to put a statement out, we need to have an action plan about what it is that we're going to do. It can't just be a statement, because a year on, we don't want to be just saying what we were saying a year ago. So we've worked out a number of actions that we're going to take, and that includes training the staff. It also includes me being on the Greater Manchester Racial Equality group, and I've joined that group. I think it's something like 200 odd people applied to go on there, and only 24 were taken on, and I've been fortunate to get on that group. But that means that I can influence things that are going on in Greater Manchester, and all of the things that we've agreed to do, we're doing. But if we hadn't written them down and said that we were going to do them, we wouldn't be doing them, but also monitoring it. The other one is really about comfort. We're thinking, how comfortable do people feel in the environment that they're in? I know in the workplace quite often I don't feel comfortable, and I was saying, I was delivering some training yesterday to Greater Manchester Fire Service, and I was saying to them, you know, when I'm in a group like this in Zoom, and I look back and I see nobody like myself, there's just me there, but how do you make me feel welcome? How do you make me feel comfortable and treat me like a human being? Because quite often people are ignored, they're sidelined, and they're sort of subtle acts of exclusion, and that's really, really important. The other one is about your consciousness. And I think that we're all conscious that we have conscious and unconscious biases, and we really need to think about how we avoid them, how we manage them. And I know myself that I've got plenty. And I was once on an unconscious bias course, and they told us to keep a diary at the end of the 2 weeks that we were on it, and I kept my diary, and you had to write in your diary every day things that came into your head that you recognise were in that filing cabinet that kept coming out. And I was on a tram going from Bury to Manchester, and many years ago my friend Jane told me that people from Droylsden in Manchester were rough, and that was in the 80s or something like that. And here I am in 2000s going into Manchester on a tram, and they announced that the tram was going from Bury to Manchester Piccadilly via Droylsden. And the first thing that came into my head was rough. Yeah, and then a fight broke out on the tram, and I texted my husband and said, those rough people from Droylsden. And I began to have to write all these things down. And now I am managing my biases. I understand them. It doesn't mean that we can't change. It's really, really important that we acknowledge that we have them. And my last C really is about that staff development, that sort of continuing professional development all of the time for all of our staff within our organisations, and that it's done through appraisals, that we set goals, all of those things. And if we do that, it means that our organisation can be anti-racist. And that's my key message for today, is that we don't want to just be not racist, we want to be anti-racist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. And I really appreciate that sometimes we make things so much more difficult than they have to be. 10 great steps, simple steps of what we can all do. So thank you very much. And if anyone wants to pick up on what Alison said, drop a note in the chat room and we'll try and figure out how to get the information to you. Thank you so much. Right, our next speaker I'm so pleased to introduce you to, and that's Caroline Riley. And I'm particularly so interested in what she's going to say today, because Caroline is with North Norfolk Stand Up to Racism group, and you may be aware that that group were very influential in making sure that the Bardsdale Refugee Centre was closed down, and that's an amazing piece of work. So thank you very much for joining us today, Caroline. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It is about the closure of Bardersfield Detention Centre that I wanted to speak about today, because it's another thread of our work in Stand Up to Racism, is welcoming refugees to Norfolk. You know, Norwich is supposed to be a city of sanctuary, and yet we had this dreadful place, Jaguar House, housing 90 refugees, mostly from Syria. Oddly, only 2 women, mainly men, and they were clearly suffered trauma. And you know, there were sort of like good things that happened and things that really needed to be improved. So I wanted to talk about those, because people had been in that Jaguar House, which is very isolated, run by Serco. You know, the guards were from Serco. And the one who came out to us when we picketed the place was very brutal. He came over as you know, proud of being brutal. In fact, it was quite intimidating. So they had those, and the food was appalling. But they'd already been there for 8 months, and legally they were only allowed to be left there for 6 months. So for 2 months they'd been on hunger strike, and a charity, which name I've forgotten, I'm afraid, so I'm sorry about that, were going in to help them, and that was very much appreciated by them, and they were like a branch of Care for Calais, so there was that, and the local Methodist church helped them, and there was also people going in from people from abroad, you know, the social workers, but nothing changed all that time. And after 6 months, you know, they were absolutely in despair. They'd been bullied, they'd suffered racism, they were picked on if they didn't wear masks, but the guards didn't wear masks. You know, there was one rule for them, one rule for the refugees. and they'd suffered such trauma, but getting no help for that. But they said the food was really bad. Anyway, so by word of mouth, it just got, you know, the people that knew each other in North Norfolk, we thought we'll go down there, and there, literally only 6 of us went. And somebody from the Green Party came from Norwich, and then it was on New Year's Day. So people couldn't go because of, you know, COVID-19. There wasn't any public transport. You couldn't share cars. That was why there was only 6 of us, and it was very cold. And we also had the press, so it got into the EDP. And so this was really good, because within 5 days, it was Jerome Mayhew, the Conservative MP, who said it'd have to be closed down. I mean, we were really surprised that it happened so quickly. So they were operating it illegally, because they weren't actually allowed to keep them there that long. And they were, where Bardersfield is, nobody knows where it is. They've got no money to spend, and so they couldn't even afford the bus fare. They would have to like walk into Coltishall to wait for a bus, you know. They got no access to anything themselves, so they were completely disempowered, and nobody knew that they were there really all that time. But this was just a big explosion of shock. So Jerome Mayhew got them shifted out. He condemned the place as being completely unsuitable for them on a number of counts, which I've already kind of mentioned what was wrong. So they got rehoused in friendship groups, so they weren't just left to themselves. They got moved to Coventry and Birmingham and other major cities, and they had expressed to us that they'd wanted to be somewhere where they could actually meet people, you know, and not just be so cut off. So I mean, it was just such a shame that they got all the way here, and they clearly suffered trauma. You could tell by the way they spoke, and you know, they'd had to suffer this on top. You know, they weren't going to get any better. I know from personal experience that refugees do suffer mental health. They're bound to, and that is one thing that gets ignored. So the mistakes that were made was that they were left there for so long. So we do need to make sure we're communicating about what's going on in our areas as soon as we find out something. That's one thing. And another mistake we made, because we thought we were having to go back there, we gave them our phone numbers, but we didn't get their phone numbers. So now they've all gone here and there, far and wide across the UK, and we've lost contact with them, is what I mean, which is a real shame. But for the future, if people could, you know, keep their ears to the ground, if these RAF, you know, military barracks are used, you know, just publicise it. One of the reasons that you might not want to, conversely, is such as what's happening in Wales, was that there was, you know, opposition to the detention centres from the far right, you know, so there's that to bear in mind, because people are intimidated in that way as well. But because we've got lots of you know, disused RAF places, it was a mess hall for RAF officers originally. We have lots of those kind of premises across Norfolk, so keep your eyes skinned that they're not used again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing your experiences of the work that you've done. And it's certainly, isn't it, if we're pooling all our lessons learned as well, what we can do better the next time. And they're small things, aren't they? But thank you so much. Thank you again. Now, I'm conscious that we've got an extra speaker, but I'm not aware he's in the group yet. Can I just check? Anyone know if Glenroy's here? No, Glenroy. So I'm going to invite you to do something with me. It involves a little bit of space. I'm not sure if you've got space where you are, but a little bit of space. I'd like you to figure out in front of you a line from 0 to 12. Okay, line 0 to 12, and I'd like you to stand on the line 0 to 12 of how how enabled you feel about the challenge that we've got around anti-racism. Okay, how far do you feel like you're ready to rock and roll and just go into it? If you're not that sure at the moment, what help can you expect, and maybe we can give you? Have a feel about that. How do you feel are on that line? Can anyone have a go? Anyone doing it with me? I can see you're not doing it with me. I can check. All right, let's just do that, because we're halfway through our speakers and I want to know that you're enabled to step in and step up to the challenge of racism. How are you feeling there? Are you there? Okay, just notice if you're a 0 to 12 where you are on that. And if you feel that you really want some more information and you really want to get involved with some of the work that's going on, put it in the chat room. Put in the chat room and we'll reach out to you and get you some information. But sometimes we actually have to physically feel where we are on that journey. It's all very well being up here and thinking about it, but we're going to have to put one foot in front of the other along that 0 to 12. Okay, so I'm going to go on to our next speaker, if that's all right, and that's our colleague, Dr. Marion Prinsley. Are you there? Yes, you are. That's absolutely superb. Thank you. Okay, let me introduce Marion. Marion is actually our Sheriff of Norwich, and it's so amazing that she stepped into this role. She's the first woman, and can I quote that you are the first woman practicing Jewish person to step into that role. So you broke barriers in getting there, and I'm so privileged to be able to say I work with you on this, and I'm looking forward to your talk today. Now, Marion is also the chair of the Norfolk Equality and Human Rights Council. It's a very new project of bringing people together to really challenge some of the failing, shall we say, but also put out there how we can actually work together. So over to you, Marion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Judaline. And the pleasure and the privilege is mine, I have to say. It was completely inspirational to hear Alison's speech and to hear about the 10 C's. And I wanted to congratulate Caroline for getting that horrendous place at Coltishall closed down. I mean, well done, because I know people have been to inspect that and the results were poor, but it didn't get closed down. So really well done. So as Judaline said, I've got the privilege of being the Sheriff of Norwich this year, and I was interested to hear at the beginning the chat there was about the acronym BAME, because halfway through my year as Sheriff, somebody mentioned to me that when I was chosen as Sheriff, I was chosen because I represented the BAME community, which was news to me. I had no idea I was a member of the BAME community by being Jewish, but evidently I am. I'm delighted to be, but I didn't know it. And I also find it a very strange acronym, and I don't think it's fit for purpose at all. So well done for that. So it's a huge pleasure for me to sit in front of the trades unions of Norfolk today. I'm an educational psychologist by profession. I worked for local authorities for 34 years in London, in Leeds and in Norfolk. And I know I've been a member of trade unions for all that time, and I know the power of unions to help. So we all need to get together to help now. This is a big problem we have in Norfolk. We are together to mark the United Nations Anti-Racism Day. Now, I really agree with what Ian said, that every day should be Anti-Racism Day. But this particular day has its origins in the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa on the 21st of March, 1960, when innocent people who were protesting about the introduction of the cruel pass law system, which legislated about where people could live depending on the colour of their skin, were fired on by police. My uncle was one of the doctors who treated the victims, all of whom had been shot in the back. I grew up in the small country of Swaziland, a multiracial country, attending fully multiracial schools. But the country was right next door to the apartheid regime, South Africa. And my oldest brother was imprisoned by the South African regime for working against apartheid in 1969. And so this day means a lot to me. And I'm always surprised that it doesn't figure more in the press, in newspapers, everywhere. Look at the papers today, I haven't seen anything about it. I even wrote a letter to the EDP asking them to publish it today, and it wasn't in. So I've lived in Norfolk for 26 years, and during this time, there have been huge demographic changes in the county, and particularly in Norwich. I can remember a time when my children were very young in school, and my family and I were walking down Newmarket Road. A parent who was a GP in one of my daughter's, who was a parent of one of the children in my daughter's class, was heard to say, "There goes that Jewish family." We were rare in those days. And as an educational psychologist who visited many of the city and county schools 25 years ago, few Black and Asian faces were to be seen in the county. A few in Norwich, but very rare in the county. Fast forward 26 years, and the situation in the city is really quite different. We are now in Norwich of many more peoples and cultures. And whilst there's not a significant representation in the county, it's growing. We live in a beautiful county and privileged to live here. But we must ensure that Norfolk and Norwich will be welcoming for all those who live here. And we must remember that the people of Norfolk have an incredibly rich and diverse history, settling here for many centuries from continental Europe. Norfolk could surely be considered amongst the first of the international counties, with Roman and Dutch and French immigrants bringing a whole swathe of new skills to the county. Such richness of diversity presents differently in the 21st century, but to see how valuable it is, just look at our hospitals and care sector. So, the Norfolk Equality and Human Rights Council. As Sheriff of Norwich during 2019 and the early part of 2020, the Lord Mayor and I invited a group of refugees through the University of Sanctuary scheme to visit us in the Lord Mayor's parlour. So Norwich calls itself a city of sanctuary and a welcoming city. So I was incredibly naive and was expecting to hear stories of how these refugees had been welcomed into the city and the county. Instead, what we heard was completely horrifying. Stories of overt and shocking racism. People of colour left deliberately behind at the bus stop when standing alone. People turned down for jobs simply because of the colour of their skin or sound of their accent. Police profiling or lack of help. Housing needs not addressed, lack of opportunity across the board. It was evident that there was a void between local authorities and grassroots organisations, and the need for a representation and advocacy to shed light on this and address issues of structural and systemic inequality. So together with a small group of people, we began to wonder how we could address these matters. Then lockdown came and the meetings we had planned were shelved while we, like everyone else, learned how to do things remotely. Then in May 2020, the killing of George Floyd took place and the Black Lives Matter movement took matters out of our hands. Jane Basham from Ipswich, Chief Executive of the Norfolk Community Law Service, and Fanuel Mutumbari, Operations Director of the Ipswich Racial Equality Council, decided to set up a group to look at hate crime in the first instance. The small group that I was with and I were delighted and joined immediately, and our first meeting was held on the 11th of June 2020. The questions were, was there a desire for a county-wide anti-hate crime network? Where could wider issues of discrimination fit in? And the chair of the Ipswich Racial Equality Council shared his experience of how things worked in Ipswich. So since June 2020, our group, the Norfolk Equality and Human Rights Council, has evolved. Sadly, owing to considerably challenging personal circumstances, Jane was unable to continue through the autumn and spring of 2021. But Marie-Lise Nmohoza, my wonderful friend, who we are privileged to have as a citizen of this city, and herself a Rwandan refugee who survived the genocide in that country, and I have co-chaired this group. We are a community-led grassroots organisation, and the decision has been taken that we will be a group which represents all the protected characteristics, not just race. But because racism is the only protected characteristic not otherwise represented in the county, since the dissolution of the previous Norfolk and Norwich Racial Equality Council in 2010, race is our focus at the moment. We plan to work strategically, and we are already working strategically across the county. And one of the issues we're tackling immediately is the lack of representation at board level in all organisations. The group is self-selecting, and encompasses a wide range of individuals from the City of Norwich and the county. And we also have a number of organisations with us, including charities representing refugees, disability, young people, etc. At our introductory event on the 16th of September last year, we generated amazing interest from individuals and from statutory agencies and from the police. And it's evident from this that there is a really pressing need for us to exist. We're working hard to develop our constitution, and we hope to gain charitable status soon. So to date, we've already seen several successes. Lost my place. Despite the fact that each one of us is a volunteer and we're all working outside of our normal working hours to try and make a difference. Our achievements include close working with the Norfolk Constabulary, which we felt was a matter of priority. And this has resulted in closer relationships between beat officers and organisations dealing with refugees. And also we have seen a result in the possibility of an increase in community engagement officers. We have representation now in the Norwich 2040 City Vision Board, which astonishingly did not include any multi-ethnic representation before we existed. And we're forging relationships with Norfolk County Council. We're liaising with the UEA, with the theatre group, and we're to hold a joint film club with the Constabulary in the near future. We're also linking with Norfolk Community Foundation, Voluntary Norfolk, and a range of other agencies, but we are keen to be an independent and freestanding group. So I guess that leaves the question of how we can collaborate and work with the trades unions. That's really a discussion for another day, probably once we have a formally adopted and agreed constitution and status with the Charities Commission. A question to leave you all to ponder, along with the question about what each one of us can do to make Norfolk a more welcoming place for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marion. And again, I've heard a real invitation to step up and to join. If you don't want to be a lone voice, there's another opportunity to join with the NEHRC as well. And thinking about some of the things that are coming up on the chat room, the notion of the 0 to 12, some days we can be really raring to go and other days we can feel a bit tired. And that's where we all work together to keep ourselves boosted and buoyant to be able to go to the next step. In the words of that famous Strictly judge, it's a bit of like a cha-cha-cha, you know, some days forward and some days back, but we're going in the right direction. So thank you, Marion, for sharing that. Our next speaker we have is Tusif Mir. I hope you're there, Tusif. Yes, I can see you. Hello. Now, Tusif is actually with the University of East Anglia. He's a research scholar and an activist based at the School of International Development. And he's also a founder of the Education and Awareness Platform on Kashmir and about the fight Islamophobia, which I think is a really pertinent piece of information and work that we really need to know more about today. And I'm looking forward to hearing your session today, Tusif. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so very much, and hello everyone. So the time's limited and the topic's a little heavy, so I'll straight away come on to the point. But then I'll have to say, like, it has been a really enriching session listening to all of you. So what I'm going to do today is that my talk would be more of like, when we talk about racism, it's like an iceberg. What we see is the tip. So I'll try to reach to the base of it. So coming to Islamophobia, why is it important? It's important because it concerns the lives of millions of Muslim citizens. It influences multiple aspects of their daily lives, from education to work to the labor market, from universities to, from the universities to the airports, from their social life to their political engagements. This Islamophobia, it manifests everywhere in their lives. So to use Baroness Saida Vasi's term, it has already surpassed the dinner table test, meaning it has been socially sort of accepted. So what is more interesting to understand here is that many of us knowingly or unknowingly are conditioned and complicit in Islamophobia. The simple test is to ask ourselves a very simple question, that Do we envision and encode events like September 11, invasion of Iraq, invasion of Afghanistan, the Paris riots, the New Zealand terrorist attack, or the genuine Palestinian or Kashmiri struggles against settler colonialism, or even the Iran crisis? Do we encode them in the lens of Islamophobia? We'll have the answer whether we are Islamophobic or not. Then the question is, why package it into racism? The simple answer is that when we simply talk about racism, it's a negative judgment or a prejudice about one or more racialized groups that are taken together as a single body, which are then inferiorized or subalternized. And flowing from there was the definition or understanding of Islamophobia of the all-party parliamentary group of the UK Parliament in 2018, who understood Islamophobia to be deeply rooted in racism and defined it to be the type of racism that targets Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. What is interesting to understand here is that the victims of Islamophobia aren't only Muslims, but all those who are perceived to be Muslims. Let us remind ourselves of the instances where many Sikhs were actually targeted because they were thought to be Muslims. Unfortunately, this definition wasn't accepted by the Tory government under the Prime Ministership of Theresa May. However, what is really important to understand here is that being critical of Islam or religion in general doesn't qualify as Islamophobia, but then direction of the hatred towards Muslims based on their faith, their practices, their heritage is the problematic one, which is actually racism and which is Islamophobia. Talking about UK, according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales, the hate crimes against Muslim adults are the highest. And apart from that, according to the UK Home Office, the total number of recorded hate crimes, 50% of them are against Muslims. So this might explain the gravity and the level of engagement and redressal that this issue of Islamophobia needs. Coming to the term Islamophobia, the term might be fairly new, but then as a phenomenon, it's quite old. It's deeply embedded in our histories, where it started or commenced as religious discrimination and then has come of age as Islamophobia. That is why, according to the anthropologist Penina Verbner, Islamophobia is a particular kind of racism that is quite reflexive, and it deeply relies on mutually constituted histories of imperial conquest, subjection, and systematic forms of oppression. What's important to understand from here is that the answers to this racism in general and Islamophobia in particular lie somewhere deep down in our history. So rewinding and taking a peek at our history, a year that is really significant is 1492. During this year, in 1492, it was the time when the Christian Spanish monarchy, it reconquered Muslim Spain. And what followed was the persecution and expulsion of Jews and Arabs from Spanish Peninsula. Simultaneously, this year marked their arrival in the non-European lands or the Orient, like Americas. And what commenced from there was the colonization of the indigenous people. These two developments, they marked the foundation of global racial or ethnic division, where Europe itself appropriated the position of the racial or ethnic superior, bolstering the Occidental narrative of the supremacy of the West versus the rest. So here, actually, they ascribed themselves the rank where their knowledge and their roles, they were superior and supreme. For instance, internally, the Arabs and the Jews, they were considered to be the people with the wrong religion and hence the wrong God. So they were considered to be inferior to the white European Christians. And externally, the indigenous people were considered to be the people with no religion and hence no God, and they occupied the bottommost ebb of this racial hierarchy. What's really important to understand here is that the thinkers and the philosophers of that time actually propounded, proffered, and propagated these narratives and these world visions. For instance, the infamous debate between Sepulveda and Las Casas in the school of Salamanca in 1550, it led to the establishment of slave trade that transferred incredible and humongous number of humans from sub-Saharan Africa to Americas. To put things into context, Sepulveda argued that indigenous people had no soul, therefore they were not humans and could be enslaved, and they wouldn't represent sin in the eyes of the god. Whereas Las Casas argued that they were savages with a soul, so they were human enough to be Christianized, and apart from being enslaved. Both these arguments, if understood properly, they represent the two broad streams of racism that has evolved ever since, the former being the biological racism and the latter being the cultural racist discourse that we are mostly encountered with today. And this was the imagination how people and the world beyond Europe was looked at. It was this lens. And what's more is that the later thinkers and philosophers actually cemented and further diffused this world vision. For instance, René Descartes. According to René Descartes' ego politics of knowledge, that is, I am, I think, therefore I am, it put the Western men, not women, it gave them the attributes of the Christian God, making them the foundation of knowledge. And this actually became the foundation of modern Western philosophy. And the contemporary scholars like Samuel P. Huntington, what they're doing is that they're actually carrying forward the same narratives. They're giving a combination of Orientalism and Occidentalism, where the superiority of the West is taken for granted, and their epistemological role or their epistemological position is taken as a given, from where they can give judgments about different people, different cultures, different religions. It is from this point of view of identity and epistemology that all other knowledges, all other cultures, all other epistemologies and world visions, they are subalternized and denigrated as myths and folklores. It is this point of view that downgrades Islam not only as a religion or spirituality, but also as a system of knowledge. So Islam and Muslim scholars and their knowledge, it is downgraded as inferior, and the Western scholars, they get the authority or the higher pedestal to create discourses and write books about Islam. It gives them the authority to downgrade Muslims as barbarians, as terrorists, as extremists, as savages, and it gives them the unilateral authority to say what's wrong with Islam and what good Muslims could do, without even making an effort for a cross-cultural or intercultural engagement. For instance, if we take Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilization, it considers the main fault line for the new Cold War or the new war to be culture instead of economics or politics. And there, the real fault line is shown that Islam, it's given that Islam has an innate propensity and Muslims have an innate propensity towards violence. And they are presented to be the greatest threat to Western civilization. And it is essentialist narratives like these that create these reductionist binaries. And this might somehow explain why for Muslims around the world, especially in Europe, war on terror appears like war on Islam. Now, coming further, the basic points or basic aspects of Islamophobia on which Islam or the Muslims are bashed. The first one, the main aspect, is that West and Muslims or Islam, they are shown to be antithetical. Antithetical in the sense that the media propagates the narratives that I was talking about, the world visions, where Islam and West, they are shown to be two binaries which are quite opposite to each other, which can't coexist. The media doesn't make an effort to show or realize that neither the West nor Islam or Muslims are homogeneous or monoliths. But then this distinction and this reduction is given to the people where Islam appears to be this other or the enemy, which can't coexist with the Western world or in the Western systems. Coming to other major aspect, which is terrorism or Islam as terrorism. So for this narrative, the one-size-fits-all model or the strawman that's given is the event of 9/11, September 11. But then why blame Muslims for that? The responsibility of the US government and the US foreign policy is never brought into question. It was the US government, it was the US foreign policy that created tens of thousands of Islamic or Muslim mujahideen in 1970s and 1980s against the evil empire, which was the Soviet Union. They cropped them, they groomed them, they raised them, and then it was the chicken coming home to the roost. Now, it was 1982, Ronald Reagan, the president of US, who actually invited them to the White House, and they were credited and accoladed as the spiritual or moral equivalents of the founding fathers of US. Or even if we watch the movie Rambo, it's dedicated to the gallant Mujahideen of Afghanistan. Likewise, simultaneously, Saddam Hussein, who was a lab baby or a darling of USA during that time, who was simultaneously fighting the US Gulf War against Iran, and later he was declared as an enemy. Talking about ISIS, Barack Obama on record said that ISIS was a creation of because of their doing in Iraq. And whatever armaments or the ammunition that they gave to the rebels in Syria and Iraq, that ended up in the hands of ISIS fighters. But then why blame Muslims for that? I think the answer is that Muslims may be the soft targets, and after the fall of communism, they might be the next vulnerable targets for their great gains. Now, coming to the other important or very essential topic, which is patriarchy or women's rights. Unfortunately, I do not consider that this has to be reduced to Islam. Even when we talk about West, the most patriarchal or conservative of the people, even Christian conservatives, they go on Islam bashing as if they've been the defenders of Islam. For instance, for George Bush, the main argument of waging war against Afghanistan was to salvage and liberate brown women from their persecuting male or menfolk. While simultaneously, what was happening in USA was they were defending actively the Christian patriarchal fundamentalism, which was opposing abortion, women's civil rights, and social rights. Equal pay in the West, it's yet to be a reality. Moreover, this fundamentalist narrative or fundamentalist reading of religious scriptures, at least of the Abrahamic religions, isn't only confined to Islam. There are many other parallel texts or abuses against women that exist in other religions likewise. But then the media,
I've got to give you a timing here. You've had a little bit more time than usual. Can you maybe come to, because I've got 2 minutes. People out to do.
All right.
1 minute. So, 1 minute.
Yeah, so in short, when we talk about this, if patriarchy as a system of gender domination is considered or given to be external to the West and located in Islam, it will be a historic distortion, and it's a problematic narrative which is quite Islamophobic. We need to realize that militarism, patriarchy, and capitalism, and even colonization, it was exported from West to the rest of the world. So what we actually, the current state is when we talk about diversity or multiculturalism, they go out of the window when it comes to Muslims. Look at the educational opportunities, equal rights, labor market, whale ban, or maybe like even when we talk about the Punish a Muslim Day or the Pegida protests. So Islamophobia, it's quite deep rooted in these world visions that have been coming on since the last 6 centuries. What needs to be done, that we need to work on the world vision.
Tusif, I'm going to have to stop you there. I'm really sorry. And it sounds like we could have done with a lot longer, but we've got we've got 2 more people to speak today. So thank you so much. And I know thank you so much. You've put so much on the table, the things about perception, the things about intersectionality, that the message is warped through time, and the whole notion of going back to where Clive started about being wrapped up with the power of the economy that influences so many things. So thank you so much for doing that. Now we're actually going to invite Vera da Silva Singer to join us. Thank you, Vera. Can I see you where you are? Vera is actually part of Norwich Stand Up to Racism. No, and she's also
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, yeah, there you are. Thank you, Vera. And amazing work that she's been doing around the whole notion of linguistics, and she's got a master's in anthropology and international criminal justice, but she's most importantly working with Indigenous communities in Brazil. I'm going to hear more about it today. Thank you very much, Vera. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just need
to share your screen. Are you all right?
Yeah, I got to share my screen now. Okay. They said I can't share. You needed to enable me. I can't hear you. They said
Can you share now?
See again. Yeah, I can share now.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, you were seeing.
Yeah, can you go on to, if you can go on to PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah,
that should do perfectly. Thank you.
Wait, yeah. Wait a minute. There's something wrong here with my thing. I want to show a slide. Where is it? Wait, I need to. Everything here got out.
Do you want me to share the slides for you?
Wait a minute. I don't know why they are so in the corner.
If you open up your screen, can you see that box in the corner? Open up the box on the corner.
Yeah.
The crosses, next box. That
Next.
should open up your screen.
Yeah.
And you can then see slideshow open up on the list of things. It's like 1, 2, 3, fourth from the right hand side. It says slideshow.
Yeah, but the problem is my computer just frozen. So I think you should share mine.
I shall share. Okay.
Yeah, because it was already here and now it's just get.
Okay, I'm going to do it because otherwise we're going to lose.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, let me get that up for you.
Yeah.
Can everyone see the slides? Can I have some feedback? Can I have some feedback that you can see the slides, someone?
Yeah, we can see them.
Excellent, there you go. Lovely, ready when you are.
Okay, but I don't see it. That's the problem. Now I can see it. Yeah. Okay, so if you begin yeah. So sorry, because it's some technical. So I was invited, thank you for the organizer to invite me to talk a little bit about racism in indigenous people of Brazil. Yeah. So today I go to show a little bit how the reality and to give you insight how the situation in Brazil at the moment and regard to indigenous people. So before I start there, I give you some background of the diversity of language and culture in Brazil. Yeah, you can click. So the indigenous population comprises nearly 1 million people. Yeah, there are 305 ethnic groups, and they speak in 274 different languages in Brazil. Yeah. So racism is quite paradoxical. I think some speakers already talk about a little bit about this. So indigenous people are seen integrate in the category of non-whites. Yeah, and their specific identity is completely ignored. It's like to put everybody in a BAME acronym. Indigenous Brazilians are accused of being barbarians, not civilized, at the same time of being too civilized and not being native enough or not real Indian. There is a widespread denial of violence, discrimination, and prejudice against indigenous people. Yeah. So racist statement by the government is very common. So I hear some example. Indians are undoubtedly changed. They are increased to become human beings just like us. Who said that? Our president. Índio antropizado, semi-antropizado, não antropizado. If this one was a statement made by the healthcare minister and mean not civilized, semi-civilized, and not civilized at all. Or people who like Indians should go to Bolivia. So this MP said that because for them, Bolivia also a place only indigenous people, very inferior. Yeah, so the denial, fossilization, negation of identity is very common since the colonization. Yeah, so for example, one already talked about the speaker before, to see said a little bit about the Islamic, how oops, no.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so the religion, the native religion of each group, each culture is denied when the Christianity come and say that you are inferior, this is not a religion, you have to be educated, civilized, they integrate. So they make the indigenous was savage or rebels, and they need to come to the idea of Christianity and this vision of harmonization. Yeah. And that's what the religion look for, and now it's more complicated, even more with the fundamentalists inside the village. Yeah. So Indians who use cell phones or wear jeans are not Indian. Yeah, for example, if you have a mobile phone, you are already too civilized. Yeah, if you wear the jeans, you are not naked, so you are not Indian anymore. And if you are a writer, wow, if you are a writer, you are not Indian because you become a writer, so you become too civilized. So that's what Olivia says. So in terms of pandemic, the situation gets even worse because it exacerbates all the inequality inside Brazil. And for example, in the beginning of the pandemic, the audios with attacks indigenous came through and the local community, because the residents noticed that most of cases of COVID in that moment had been resistant in the indigenous community, right? So the indigenous were pointed out by some residents as being responsible for transmit COVID-19. So this brought a lot of conflict in the region. Yeah. So for example, in terms of the pandemic situation, many indigenous faced, when they start dying, they go to the hospital or to be registered as a dead indigenous people, the government or the government agency didn't recognize them because they said they are not in the village. But when they die in the village and they go to get help from the state, they said they can't recognize them because they don't have the proper document. So these happen all the time. In the end, all these people, for example, in Kokama people, they decide to count and to look after the dead themselves, during this pandemic. So in terms of violence against indigenous people, case of violence against indigenous people has increased 150% in the first year of Bolsonaro government. 130 murders often that year. Indigenous people were recorded in 2019. And according with the report, this is a result of a brutal dismantling and inspection and protection of bodies of territories. And the FUNAI was also is completely dismantled, and these are kind of agents used to have a power to protect the indigenous people, but now the reduction of its importance and purpose is kind of a policy in there. So as a result of that, that's the death, right? Ari Urewawa was murdered in March last year. He was my student in the past. Who he was? He's from Urewawa community, and he was responsible for his reporting illegal logging with the village. And then Zezico Rodrigues Guajajara, also murdered last year. He was the leader of Guajajara people. Is a dispute land in the region, and 2 other members of his community also was murdered, executed in 2019. Raimundo e Firmino Guajajara. Isaac Tembe was murdered in December. And then December, no, February, and 1 month later, his brother was murdered too. Also, who killed them is a police officer from the military police force locally. They are also involved in the question of the land dispute in the region.
Sorry.
So,
sorry.
I want to say that the Didi Tembe was executed broad daylight in the morning on the Tuesday, 2nd of March, 2021. So the current affairs in Brazil today: land grabs, insufficient health care, deforestation, and stigmatization of treatment of indigenous Brazilians. The government have dismantled environment protection of the Amazonia, and deforestation is massively increased, as everybody already know. The government also curtailed indigenous people land rights and turned a blind eye to illegal mining, logging, and farming operation in the territory, and create new policy to allow mining the land in the indigenous land. They created last month, I think. Misinformation and denial of identity is a common thing, but the government sectors, such as CESAI, refuse to assist community live in the cities, even though this is an unconstitutional discrimination, is deny the identity and contribute to misinformation about community. Yeah, the president downplays the overall severity of the pandemic. This negligence is resulting in a high number of victims of COVID-19, as you know, but many communities are dealing with the pandemic by themselves. Today, with many lost, particularly elderly victims, many communities across Brazil had lost the guardian and the custodian of the culture and linguistic heritage through the pandemic and the violence and the racism against them. Yeah, so Kasik Hauni, I don't know if many of you have already heard about him. So he asked to the International Criminal Court this year to investigate the President Jair Bolsonaro for crimes against, oops.
No, that wasn't me.
For crimes against humanity. He accused him of unprecedented environment damage, killing and persecution of the people in the area. So, yes, fora Bolsonaro. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I do apologise. I'm not sure what happened with the technical, but thank you so much for sharing all that information with us. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure there's plenty in the group. There's been lots of chat going on there, Vera, as well, so I'm sure people will want to come up with it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We have a final guest to join us now, and that's Maria Patinga Wallace. She is a representative of Show Racism the Red Card. It's one of the largest, I think, educational charities looking at anti-racism in the education centre. Thank you so much for joining us today, Maria. And you're on there as well, so it works. Thank you very much. Over to you. You're not on presentations. Ah, there you are. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Hello.
I can't talk. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. So today's going to be an opportunity, I'm really happy to say, to build on what a lot of our fantastic speakers have already said. What an event we've had. From an anthropological point of view, historical point of view, we've had the practitioner perspective, the political perspective. What a great event. So I'm going to share to you from kind of a practical point of view. So in the charity, we work with lots of schools, but also increasingly workplaces as well. And it is going to be an opportunity to interact. So please do share in the chat, or you're very welcome to come off mute as well and share directly with me your perspective too. So we're going to get back to basics a little bit, and we're going to talk about what actually is racism. And actually, Addison made a really good point. If we don't know what racism is, how do we even confront it on a day-to-day basis? So we know that racism at a very basic standpoint is treating someone differently because of their. And we in the charity talk about 4 main components. Would anyone like to share what they think that is? So what are the 4 main components, characteristics, experiences in which racism is based? Any thoughts? And Julian, I don't think I can see the chat actually. So if you're able to let me know if there's any contribution, that'd be great.
The first one up is skin colour.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
We've got religion.
Woo! Definitely.
They're working here, aren't they? And nationality. One more.
What's our 4th?
Culture. Had a suggestion about, oh, there you go.
Absolutely. I knew this group would be on form. And because I knew this group would be on form, you're all either actively anti-racist or working towards that. And so that's why we really want to build on that. And again, it was mentioned earlier about the fact that we have very obvious forms of racism that we're all appalled at. Forms of violence and murder. That's not acceptable to anyone. That's completely socially unacceptable. But at the same time, there are forms of racism that are socially still acceptable. Does anyone have any ideas of what that might be? And again, it's building on a lot of the contribution that we had earlier. what forms of racism do you think are actually acceptable on a day-to-day basis in our communities and in our workplaces and in our schools? Definitely in our schools.
You can use the chat room or just yell out. Language. Someone said none. Someone said none at all, but someone's also put Johnson's comments.
Yeah, absolutely, completely embedded. We've seen that through the language and behaviours of some of our leaders. And so this was picked up earlier. So apathy, minimisation, concealed racism and discrimination. And we're going to build on that in our next slides, where we're going to have a range of different options, different examples, and we'll talk through some more. But in terms of for us to be able to do that, I'm just going to define these and unpick them a little bit. But before I do that, I just wanted to big up this book. And again, this was mentioned in the first 15 minutes of this session today. It's a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Abraham Kendi. And in the book, he talks about racism. So it's building on that first definition that I looked at. And it says, racism is a marriage of racist policies and ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. So it's a build on that more simplified version that I shared earlier. But he continues. And so he talks about a racist being one who is supporting a racist policy or agenda through their actions or inaction. And that's a really important patience and saying nothing. Being a bystander is a form of being racist. Inaction or expressing a racist idea. So by consequence of that, an anti-racist is someone who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So what we're talking about here is the everyday racism, the socially acceptable, that has become embedded in our institutions. It's become so subtle and embedded in our education, in our workplaces, in our media, that we no longer realize that it's racist. And so we'll look at that some more with these examples. And what I'd love for you to do is for each of these, please help me identify, let's do this as a group, which of these do we think are examples of apathy? So a lack of interest in the existence of racism. What are the examples of apathy? And again, please share in the chat or share directly with me. A lack of interest in racism.
I don't see colour.
Yeah,
it doesn't. All lives matter. It doesn't exist anymore. Colour blindness.
Yeah. I would agree with all of those, and I think none of these are fixed. There definitely is a fluidity with all of these definitions, but I would say that racism doesn't really exist anymore. We live in an equal society. It's definitely a really clear point of apathy. And actually, it feels strange that someone would put that idea forward, but actually, before George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, there was definitely a feeling from many people, particularly in positions of power, still in positions of power, that we live in a post-racial society. That we have so many people from Black, Asian, minority, ethnic backgrounds in workplaces that surely discrimination and racism doesn't exist anymore. You can't get away with using the N-word or the P-word in the workplace. So what's all the fuss about? And then we saw inevitably during the summer that there were very vivid and clear examples that racism still exists. But still we do not question the colonized curriculum that our children still learn each and every day. And that's where it's completely embedded. So yeah, so really good examples there. And I think it's clear to see the examples that are completely unacceptable, the racism, deaths in police custody, acts of terrorism that would never be acceptable. We would hope that far-right rhetoric isn't, but as someone mentioned earlier, we see it in our politicians. We saw it with the UN referendum. It inflames and increased examples of hate crime because it becomes embedded in the use of our politicians and other positions, other people of power using far-right rhetoric. So actually it is a form of acceptable discrimination. What do we think about concealed racism? And actually, what does that mean? Would anyone like to give me an example of what concealed racism actually means? The clue is in the name.
Do you want to put it in the chat room, anyone?
Any examples?
Terrorism. No, I've missed that. They may see
That would, so
they may-
terrorism would be an example of violence. So a very,
yeah, we've got, they may say things to see if you agree with them.
yeah, absolutely.
Language again.
But actually, a good point about terrorism, the fact that after terrorist acts, and someone put in the chat earlier when Tusef was speaking about the historical implications and catalysts for Islamophobia, where the terrorist acts are described as Muslim acts. And so it becomes acceptable to be racist against those groups that are associated with the acts of terrorism. So actually it is a really good point about it being a concealed form.
Subtle acts of exclusion or microaggressions or non-appointment of staff, them and us.
Language, yes, absolutely. Coded language, they're not a good fit. They're a bit of a maverick, aren't they? I don't think they're really, you know, I don't think they're going to be a good part of our team. They're usually always late, aren't they? All of these subtle and sometimes very obvious comments, but they do become acceptable because they are not questioned. So it's building on stereotypes. So microaggressions are the everyday subtle comments that make someone feel part of an outsider group. Where are you from? Oh, your hair, can I touch your hair? Wow, it's quite hard, isn't it? All of these sorts of comments are what reinforces the insider and the outsider groups. So, but they can feel so subtle that as someone who experiences a microaggression, you may not even feel that you are part of this concealed racism, but it impacts on your well-being, your mental health, and your motivation to want to be part of a project, a group, or a community. So examples here of discrimination. What here would be examples that are used frequently, but are, when you think about it a little bit more, examples of discrimination. Actually, there's an example here that we haven't touched on that is an example of minimization. That hasn't been given to me, and it's an example of minimization I'd just like to talk about for a little bit. What do we think about this use of BAME that's come under quite a level of scrutiny recently? Do we think that could be a form of minimization? And if so, why?
I think Alison brought it up when she was saying of how we can just be lumped together and there's no individuality, and there's a, you know, it was put together to serve a purpose, and it wasn't about the individuals. It was very much about, you know, let's put it all to the monitoring. And someone's put too simplistic. People are not a minority ethnic globally. Absolutely, we are in the majority, and it's denying identity is very contributed there. So
yeah, absolutely, which is why I cannot understand why people of colour has become the acceptable replacement. That's my viewpoint. That's not the perspective of Show Racism and the Red Card, but I'm also a diversity and inclusion consultant, and I do not see how people of colour has become an acceptable replacement for Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. But what we do see is that organisations, when, for example, they report their ethnicity pay gap, they'll say BAME ethnicity pay gap, and it doesn't look at the distinction between particular groups. Or organisations will applaud themselves and pat themselves on the back and say, wow, our increase of BAME representation in senior management has doubled. But what it means is that there's one group that has increased, and a particular group, and I will say that it's usually the Black group, hasn't increased, but the minority ethnic or the Asian representation has. But in any instance, it's about looking at particular groups rather than, as we've said, looking at that whole conglomerate. It's not useful. But sometimes, you know, we need
sorry, someone's just said it sounds like you've been to their workplace. I'm describing their workplace, so yes.
Okay, and just a final point, what do we think about racial profiling? When would that ever be acceptable? And what do we think that would be classified as? Would it be apathy, minimization, concealed racism, or discrimination? What do we think? And when would that ever be acceptable? What does it even mean? So racial profiling will be when particular groups are under further scrutiny for purposes of protection. So for example, during a Stormzy concert in Europe, I can't remember where he was, the security team in his concert said that there was someone in his management group that had a gun. And so what they did is they said, we need to search you. And Stormzy said, I'm not going to perform. So it just shows you that in that position of power, he was able to withdraw his service but he made the point of saying, search the team. There was no gun. So that was an example of racial profiling. But when is it an acceptable, well, acceptable in the form that it's part of an acceptable part of society to some extent? Would anyone like to give an example?
Maria, I just need to give you a time's up in case you're not aware. We've got 1 more minute before they all have to go off to the outside broadcast. So
gosh, what a
if
shame.
you can just bring that together, I'm sure they'll pick up on things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to give the example of, it's a personal example. When my son went to a cinema, he was the only one of his white group of friends who was asked to have his bag searched by a security guard. So that would be an example of profiling. There was also an example where Olympians Bianca Williams and Ricardo dos Santos were asked to step away from their car. They were separated from their 3-month-old from the London Metropolitan Police because they were stopped and searched and separated from their 3-month-old son. So that would be what is seen as an acceptable form of racial profiling, but obviously to us, that would not be seen as acceptable. But that's to wrap up the session. I'm just gonna close it on this slide for anyone who would like any further information about support for any experiences of racism that they have had. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Maria. Thank you. Now everyone will see that there's a link to our music that's coming straight after this. But before that, can I just thank all our speakers who've given their time, really interesting. And I certainly want to follow up with what they've been saying. Can I also, though, take an opportunity to thank someone who's no longer with us, and that's Mike Waterman. He was from East Anglia, Stand Up to Racism. He's done an incredible work. He passed away, sadly, in February. And that's who we need to thank. We never forget their contributions. So thank you all for today. Thank you for my colleagues for making this happen. And I'm so proud of everyone that's turned up. We've had over 40 people with us today. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the performances today. Go safely. Be well. Thank you.